So when I think about the concept of reimagine Toledo, and I put it in a historical perspective, because I'm kind of a history geek and that's what I do, I immediately start to think about 4 individuals. And these people, I think, kind of embody the whole concept of reimagine, recreate, think anew. And the first person is this gentleman right here. Anybody know who this is? So Jessup Scott. Most of us here in Toledo are familiar with Jessup Scott, probably because we drive down Collingwood Boulevard and we notice this giant, beautiful high school that was built in 1913 and just recently restored. But not many of us, I'm assuming, think to ourselves, who was Jessup Scott? What was he all about? Well, I can tell you that he was an amazing man. He was a teacher, he was an attorney, he was a writer, he was a publisher, he was an editor, he was a philanthropist, he was an entrepreneur, he was a community leader, and most important to me, he was a visionary. He was somebody in a 19th century world who was thinking ahead to the 20th century when he coined the pamphlet that some people scoff at today, but we know it was actually a very visionary thing, and it was called Toledo, a Future Great City of the World. And in this pamphlet, he compared the Toledo area to cities like London and New York, and he was really, really stretching the bounds of what it meant in 1868 to say that Toledo would be a future great city. Now, you put it in perspective, he also owned a lot of real estate, and he owned most of what we know as downtown Toledo today. So he had a dog in the hunt, so to speak, if he could convince people Toledo was a great place. But at the same time, I think he really believed in that vision. And I think what sets him apart is that at that time, no one really thought of interior cities as being great cities. In 1868, these were just stop-offs on the way westward. Great cities were on the shore and they were connected back to Europe. But he had this vision of what could happen based on being located next to the Great Lakes, being available to the natural resources that we have, and the transportation. One thing that I find very admirable about this gentleman is he also was someone who put his money where his mouth is. He knew that in order for Toledo to be a great city, it had to have a very strong education base. So he donated 168 acres of his own property outside of town, and that became the start of what's called the Toledo University of Arts and Crafts, I believe. And today we know that property as the Scott Park campus of the University of Toledo. So this 19th century person's vision is still having an effect on us today in the 21st century. And that's power of recreate, reimagine, think anew. The Jessup Scott story, I think, if you put it all in chronological order, flows nicely into the next gentleman that I think about when I think about reimagine, and that's this person right here, and this is George Pomeroy Jr. And Pomeroy name was a very important name in the community back in the 1800s. His father, Pomeroy Sr., was a very prominent citizen. But George Pomeroy Jr. was a little different. He was part of a group of what you might think of today as young guns who wanted to change Toledo. And in the 1880s, there was an old guard that said Toledo will always be a grain exchange. We sit on the lakes, we sit on the river, we're going to be a grain exchange. And this young gun group that he was part of was called the Toledo Businessmen's Committee. And they had an idea of taking Toledo to the next step. And they wanted to attract industry and make Toledo an industrial center. And this was way outside the realm of what the old guard thought Toledo should be. But they went in together, they attracted the money. He was in the real estate business, he was also in the banking business. But when you ask the question, today we all know Toledo is the glass city, the glass capital. It didn't happen by accident. It happened because of people like George Pomeroy. George Pomeroy and the Toledo Businessmen's Committee put together a series of advertisements that went out globally to businesses all over the world saying, come to Toledo, Ohio, and see what we have in the way of labor force, natural resources, and other programs that are available. We want to make Toledo an industrial center. They targeted specific industries. And they were targeting the glass industry at the time because at that time we were surrounded by all kinds of natural gas wells. And they knew that natural gas was a very important factor for someone who was running a glass business. So one of the people who answered the ad that George Pomeroy and the Toledo Businessmen Committee put together was Edward Drummond Libby. And he's operating a business in Boston that he inherited from his father. He has some issues. He's thinking about moving the business, and he's getting advertisements from all over the world, including this area, Fostoria, Tiffin, other communities who had access to this natural gas were all trying to attract these glass industry executives. So Libby gets on a train and he comes out to kick the tires in Toledo. And he comes to George Pomeroy's real estate office. And this is where Pomeroy is given credit of being a true genius. Pomeroy notices that Libby has his eye on a woman who was visiting the office at that time, and her name was Florence Scott. And yes, she's the granddaughter of Jessup Scott, who I just talked about. And he comes up with this brilliant idea of hosting a dinner party, Pomeroy does, at his house that night. And that party takes place in this home, which is literally a stone's throw from where I'm standing right now. And in fact, I took this shot on Sunday afternoon, and you can see the top of the building we're in, just the back in the corner. This is the Casey Pomeroy house, which is over here in Vistula. And Pomeroy hosts this party, and the story, as you know, Libby and Scott fall in love. They end up getting married. Business moves to Toledo, and that particular couple benefits this community to this day. But the power is not in just that Pomeroy was smart enough to quickly put together a dinner party. I think Libby moved his business here for a lot of other reasons, including a labor strike and some other issues that were going on back in Boston. But to me, the story about glass in this community, again, wasn't an accident. It took someone to reimagine Toledo as something different than what it was at that time. And Pomeroy and the Toledo Businessmen's Committee get credit for that. The next person I want to talk about is my favorite Toledo in history. When I tell different history stories, John Gunkel always comes to the top because I just love this man for what he did. This picture, I think, was taken in at the World's Fair in St. Louis. This guy was a heck of a fisherman, and I could tell you stories about that too. But the story I want to tell you about John Gunkel goes back to a time in the late 1880s when he was a passenger agent for a local railroad. And he had an office downtown in the Booty House. And it's B-O-O-D-Y, not T-Y. Everyone always gets that confused. And the Booty House was a really impressive building, and it sat where the National City Bank sits today over on Madison and St. Clair. And it was the central spot for downtown Toledo. And he had an office there as a passenger agent, and he interacted every day with the bootblacks, the shoeshines, and the newsboys. And he saw the plight that these kids were in, and he had a feeling for that. Now you got to put it all in perspective. In 1892, the newspaper industry explodes with the steam press. They're suddenly just pumping out newspapers by the thousands. The problem is they have no distribution network. They don't have car vans. They don't have the internet. They have child labor. And so they depend on boys as young as 8 to 10 years old who quit school and go onto the streets, and they sell newspapers for a penny apiece. And they make their living doing it. And what happened in Toledo is just prior to Gunkel's involvement, there were a lot of different people taking advantage of these kids. There's a story of a woman that owned a boarding house over where the library is today, and she invited all the newsboys to come live with her, and she'd feed them. She also convinced them that she had a strong box, and they should put all their extra money in the strong box, and she'd help them plan their future. And she disappeared with the strong box. And that was kind of one of the things that pushed John Gunkel over to the edge, and he decided he was going to actually organize the newsboys. So Christmas 1892, he hosts a Christmas party in the Maritime Building. And hundreds of these boys show up, and he convinces them to organize into the Toledo Newsboys Association. And the idea is, let's figure out how we can better ourselves and be something other than what people around the community call the street urchin. Let's figure out how we can build a future together. This becomes a national model, and it's then picked up all over the country. Gunkel becomes kind of a cult figure, going around and speaking to different communities about the whole Newsboys model. He writes a book on the subject called Boyville, And again, he just becomes kind of a famous person for what he was able to do in the community. He also really was an organizer. He ended up taking these ragtag kids, pulled them together in this association. They ended up forming a cadet program. They ended up forming a band. This postcard shows you the band. I love this image. This band actually played at Teddy Roosevelt's inaugural parade. He also ends up raising enough money to build this beautiful building. And this building was located where most of you probably parked your cars today. It was right across the street where the Vistula lot is today. That's where the Newsboys building was located. And this building had a 1,200-seat theater, classrooms, vocational training programs. And there are men in this community today who will tell you they learned how to swim in that building because they had an indoor swimming pool. And Gunkel built this as part of his effort to kind of see a better future, reimagine a better future for these newsboys. The Boys and Girls Clubs today is a direct result of John Gunkel's Newsboys Association. So once again, someone's vision in the 1890s lives today in the 21st century because they had the ability to reimagine a better future for others. My favorite story about John Gunkel, this is from the Toledo News-Bee. There was a story of some business executives sitting around a cocktail table at a private club, and a newcomer to the area says, "Who is this John Gunkel guy and where did he make his money?" And the retort from one of the older, wiser people was, "John Gunkel doesn't make money, he makes men." So I always thought that was a cool quote about somebody. The last person I want to speak about, and she's last only because I'm doing this chronologically and trying to stick with the historical programs, is Ella P. Stewart. Ella P. Stewart was the daughter of a sharecropper. She lived in a time when most white women, middle-class women, barely made it out of primary school. She went on as an African-American to graduate from the University of Pittsburgh. She became one of the first African-American pharmacists in the United States. She and her husband eventually moved to Toledo, and they opened a pharmacy in what was called the Pinewood District, African-American community here in Toledo. It was on Park in Indiana. And this became a very big central headquarters for the African-American community. They came into the pharmacy to get Miss Stewart's advice about different things that are going on. And then she began to really grow in terms of her power base in the Toledo area. So it's one thing to think that this woman was able to buck a prejudice system, become one of the first African-American pharmacists, but it doesn't stop there. She becomes this powerhouse. She works very diligently to promote programs around civil rights and workers' rights in Toledo. She eventually, in '48, becomes president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. She was president from '48 to '52. And then in the '50s, she was actually made an ambassador for the United States, and she traveled all over Asia representing the United States. The best part of her story for me is when she was asked later in life what she was most proud of. It was 1961 when they named an elementary school after her here in Toledo. So the next time you get a chance to drive past the Ella P. Stewart Academy, think about what our world would be today without someone like her having that ability to reimagine a better Toledo for others. So I'm going to close by just coming back to the beginning of this concept of reimagine, recreate. When I think about these four individuals, it's easy to say they all had some things in common: energy, vision, passion. But the one thing that I think is most impressive, we're all products of the time and the culture that we live in, even today. What makes these people different? They stepped out of that box and said, I can do something different, I can do something better, I can do something for the future, and I can reimagine a better Toledo. So I would imagine there's a few of you in this room today who probably have that kind of talent, and my hope is 100 years from now, some history geek will be up front telling your story. Thank you.